Is it true that the first detectives were not like Sherlock Holmes at all, but criminals? When did Scotland Yard appear, and why were the first detectives hated? Why were female detectives so popular in Victorian England? Was Holmes a private investigator, and who was his prototype? Let's find out what was the real life of detective work geniuses. Together with the London journalist David Murray, we are preparing to meet the most mysterious and most famous private investigator of Victorian England, and this is not Sherlock Holmes. So, meet Ignatius Paul Polacchi. His name is unfairly forgotten now and tells you nothing, but he had worldwide fame once. The journalist David Murray described him this way. Mr. Ignatius Polacchi hides more secrets than Dickensian lawyer Tulkinghorn from Bleak House. Polacchi is the prince of detectives and the king of spies. He knows frightening, eerie secrets of many, but in his appearance and behavior there is nothing special at first glance. There were no photographs of him, and he preferred to keep a low profile, except for this cartoon from the famous Londoners series of Figure magazine. His Paddington Street office was also a legend decades before Baker Street, and the detective himself was called Polacchi of Paddington. The services of a genius detective cost a lot of money, and he was often accused of it, but everyone knew that he was absolutely incorruptible. He also had his own approach. By the way, subscribe to our channel right now not to miss the next video. What was the craziest remedy to lose weight which was used in the early 20th century? Why did the Romans rinse their mouth with old urine? How did the beauties apply false eyelashes in the 19th century? Top 7 beauty procedures that will make even men's hair stand on end. Don't forget to hit the notification bell. The first private investigators appeared in the 18th century, and they didn't look like the famous Sherlock Holmes at all. The prototype of private detective was a thief hunter. That's what this profession was called in the old days. Well, the most famous representative of this profession was thief hunters general Jonathan Wild or Jonathan the Great. Sherlock Holmes mentioned him as well, but as a famous criminal. It is difficult to imagine, but the ordinary police didn't exist in England at all until the 30s of the 19th century. It was believed that order maintaining and property protection was a duty of citizens themselves. Of course, it was a bad idea. At the time, Nikolai Kramzin wrote, "Nowhere thieves were tolerated as clearly as in London. They had their clubs there, their taverns, and they were divided into different classes: infantry and cavalry, burglars and pickpockets. The English were afraid of strict police and would rather be robbed than see guards and police stations everywhere, and live in the city as in a camp." So, the thief hunters appeared. They were not paid a regular salary, but for the arrest of a criminal, the state and the community paid them a huge amount of money, £40, and gave them property and weapons of the convicted person as well. But there was a mandatory condition. The court must consider the guilt proved, so the thief hunters' duties included collecting evidence too. Thief hunters opened their offices, prototypes of a private detective bureaus, and got their sources in the criminal environment. And the most famous criminal, Jonathan the Great, went further. He secretly became the leader of London's underworld, divided the city into districts, and put his captains everywhere. So the thieves themselves were bringing him the stolen goods, and those who refused to cooperate with him were caught by him and handed over to the government. The thief hunter Jonathan the Great owned a detective office and a luxury villa in London, carried a cane with a gold crown, and was a famous crime fighter. He sent about 100 street thieves to the gallows, those who didn't want to enter his organized crime group. As a result, when all this was revealed, Jonathan the Great was executed. But his name was immortalized by Henry Fielding. The author of the novel about the thief hunter's general, Henry Fielding, went down in history as one of the creators of modern British law enforcement system. He was the first who built a team of 6 people to catch criminals. After the death of Henry Fielding, this team was headed by his completely blind brother, who could recognize more than 3,000 thieves by voice. However, it didn't help. At the beginning of the 19th century, a wave of crime simply swept London, which was considered the most dangerous city in the world. By 1828, there were districts in London where they were robbing in broad daylight. In general, there were up to 30,000 professional bandits in London. As Daniel Kluger wrote in the book Geniuses of Investigation, when the situation became disastrous, Home Secretary Robert Peel started to create the regular police force. The first 1,000 police officers appeared on the English streets in 1829. By the way, the Londoners themselves, who had to be protected by police, reacted to policemen extremely nervously. They considered it a restriction on their freedoms. On the streets appeared following proclamations: "Brothers Londoners, all as one to fight the police!" Such a thankful city. And 13 years later, Home Secretary created a special unit of detectives. 12 police officers took off their uniforms and began to act undercover. They were placed in the building where the Scottish kings stayed in the old days when visiting the Royal Court of London, the same Scotland Yard. They were called the first detectives. Charles Dickens was the very first who told us about detectives, and who, by the way, often went on raids with the police and investigators. His protagonist introduced himself as a police detective for the first time. Well, what were the daily activities of the detectives? Do you think about mysterious murders? Not at all. Everyday routine of private detectives were divorce cases, searching for runaway girls, disputes over property. One of the most popular crime back then was blackmail. Many well-known Victorian London detectives specialized in fight against blackmailers. But the most famous and popular among them, the real terror of blackmailers, was our protagonist, Ignatius Plocki. Even judges themselves appealed to him in such cases. Well, what was the second most popular crime which made the citizens to appeal to detectives? More prosaic cases, like involvement in prostitution and trafficking in women. They were hired to work ostensibly as maids or governesses and transported to France to work in brothels. Plocki was the best here as well. He was an expert in such cases and became a freelance employee of the Young Women Protection Society. According to his biographers, even the famous Pinkerton Agency couldn't compete in fame with Plocki's Paddington Agency. Often he also carried out delicate assignments for the government. Most of his investigations are shrouded in mystery even now, and he left us an incredible amount of mysteries, including a favorite technique of private detectives of that time: encrypted newspaper ads. His ads remained undecipherable. How do you like this one? Lehman Rome. Hour 50, 52, 53, safe. 51, 52, threatening fingerprints. 51, fought nobly. 13, plucky Paddington Street. All these strange ads were published in a special column with wanted ads in the Times newspaper. It's interesting. It seems an unthinkable cipher, but crime-obsessed Londoners of that time read with ease. Everyone knew that numbers were pages, columns, and chapters of several popular publications, from the Bible to the postal directory. Only Polacki's ads remain unread until now. However, despite its popularity, the private investigator profession had a low status. English public opinion continued to hate and despise not only private detectives, but also Scotland Yard detectives. Grabbers, cops, bloodhounds, so called them ordinary Londoners. One day, English judge acquitted a defendant who didn't hide that he was preparing an attempt on the life of French Emperor Napoleon III during his visit to Great Britain. He was acquitted with applause of the audience only because the prosecution was based on the testimony of hated bloodhounds. In 1869, the number of detectives at Scotland Yard rose to 24. It is no wonder that a few decades later, Sherlock Holmes was quite a successful competitor to Scotland Yard. Hardly surprising is Inspector Lestrade's annoyance to Sherlock as a representative of hated but numerous squad of criminalized private detectives. The biggest blow to Scotland Yard was a series of murders of prostitutes, which were committed by the killer who got a nickname Jack the Ripper for his cruelty. Scotland Yard was never able to find the killer, but the crimes ended as abruptly as they had begun. Maybe one of the private detectives caught up with the Jack the Ripper. Who was Sherlock Holmes? Many people will answer without even thinking, private detective. And they will be mistaken. The reputation of private investigators in Victorian England was so bad that Conan Doyle would never have made his hero a private investigator. Holmes was actually a consultant detective for Scotland Yard, a special constable. Our protagonist, Ignatius Polacki, who retired 20 years before the appearance of Holmes, had got this position with great difficulty. So, he can call himself the world's only consulting detective for Scotland Yard. Crime stories appeared and became insanely popular in the second half of the 19th century. So popular that Conan Doyle couldn't publish his first novel about Holmes for 2 years. There were too many novels of such type on the market, and publishers didn't want to deal with it. Clever and astute detectives before him exposed criminals, but it was Conan Doyle who, unlike his predecessors, decided to create a bright image of a detective, noble and fair, which would be respected and loved by readers as well. Sherlock became the most iconic detective of all time. He even appears in the Guinness World Records as the most filmed literary hero. And Chesterton compared him to Santa Claus. He was closely linked to life and language of the people. Researchers of Conan Doyle's work have calculated the age of Sherlock. In the book His Last Bound, 1914, Holmes was about 60 years old. That means he was born in 1854. But this was a fiction Sherlock. And who was his prototype? The author himself wrote that it was a popular British surgeon, Joseph Bell. Conan Doyle's mentor, the idol of students, was famous for his ability to guess the profession and fate of a person, judging by minor details, like the detective in the books. By the way, the Doctor was closely associated with the work of detectives. Joseph Bell consulted Scotland Yard on several occasions, including the case of Jack the Ripper. Bell was working as a state forensic expert for more than 20 years, but because of his secrecy we don't know much about his cases. "I can say almost nothing about it," he said in 1893. "It would be unfair to mention secret information belonging to the state." However, everyone heard about a big case of the wife killer Jean Chantrelle, one of the most famous crimes of Victorian Britain, which was solved thanks to the deductive method of Dr. Bell. While studying at the University of Edinburgh, Conan Doyle struggled to earn enough money to get into Professor Bell's famous lectures. It was there that he demonstrated to the students his ability and what went down in history as the deductive method of Sherlock Holmes. He always advised the students, "Look with all your eyes, young man. Turn on your ears, your mind, the perception bomb. Use your power of deduction." Bell was a tall, wiry man with attentive eyes, thin shoulders, and a sharp voice. He smoked a pipe, conducted chemical experiments. Well, he looked like Holmes. However, recently British scientists found another Sherlock's prototype, Jerome Caminada, an investigator from Manchester. He became popular in England in the 1880s, that is shortly before Conan Doyle created his Sherlock. The detective from Manchester, like Holmes, was obsessed with his work and resorted to clever and eccentric methods of changing his appearance. But let's go back to our protagonist. What were Pollock's methods? Here is how he described them in an interview with the journalist Murray. "The essence of my system is its secrecy. I don't keep any records and I have no secretary in my office. My employees don't know each other. In my memory and my notebook, they appear under the numbers. My people are small, inconspicuous, seemingly insignificant. They can follow you on the trail and you won't notice them." Pollock's services were used by many foreign governments, and he was called the King of Spies for a reason. He kept the secrets of his agents as carefully as the secrets of his clients, and only one of his agents was depicted in the portrait in his office, a beautiful young woman whose name he never told anyone. The only thing he told the reporter was, "This beauty is the most charming and brilliant adventuress I have ever met." Was she a prototype of Irene Adler? By the way, female private detectives were incredibly demanded in the 19th century. In the middle of the century, the divorce procedure was simplified, and it was enough to prove the infidelity of the spouse, cruelty, or immoral behavior. Of course, evidence and witnesses were required. Then it turned out that female detectives were the best at overhearing conversations. They could discreetly follow unfaithful spouses and then, of course, testify in court. The newspapers at that time wrote about some of the female investigation geniuses. The very first female detective was an American Kate Warren. She was a real star of the Pinkerton Agency. She could find out the things that men could never learn. She even managed to save the life of an American president once. But the first ever detective agency opened by a woman appeared in London. It was founded by another famous female detective, Maud West. Her signature was dressing up. She was extremely good at cross-dressing. Once she managed to bring alight a female blackmailer. Maud pretended to be a rich man, and the woman jumped at the bait. Maud West specialized in adultery, searched for stolen valuables, and exposed fraudsters. But there were also serious cases. During the First World War, she managed to find several German spies. Well, how did the story of the most famous detective of the 19th century, Ignatius Blok, end? Over the years, the criminal world hated Blok more and more. Many adventurers vowed to deal with him. Blok's house became a fortress. He locked himself inside and opened fire on those who knocked on the door. He was sure he was being hunted. He suspected to be pursued by German government agents. It's hard to say today whether it was a mental illness, but he obviously knew too much and had too many enemies. He died at the age of 90. His famous intellect failed him. He didn't recognize anyone. One of his biographers wrote, "He was the Sherlock Holmes of the real world, and perhaps much more important than the book character with whose name he is connected." Do like and subscribe if you enjoyed this story. Oh, and click on the bell so you get notified when the new episode comes out.